So, you're standing at the old main entrance, okay? And when this building was first built, it was started in 1811. This tour is going to be about 4 phases, really, of this campus. So, it was originally a prison, Richmond Bridewell. It was a prison for most of the 19th century. Now, this prison, Richmond Bridewell, was not a prison for high offenders or serious offenders. It was a place where you were held on remand when you were charged with something, or you were held for minor crimes. After that, the British Army took it over, and it was a barracks, Wellington Barracks, until 1922. And of course, that incorporates some very dramatic years in Irish history. And from 1922, which is the year, of course, of Irish independence, it was an Irish Army barracks until 1991. And finally, after the Irish Army pulled out, of course, it was made into Griffith College, the great seat of learning that we all admire so much today. Okay, we're going to go inside the Cease to Do Evil, and we're going to talk about the prisoner experience. This was the governor's residence of the prison. And down on either side, radiating out in all directions, were the cells. Now, most people, as I said, who came to Richmond Bridewell were charged with small crimes, and typically this was larceny, was stealing. Now, there are a few more serious cases, especially in the later 19th century, of political prisoners. We'll talk a lot about them, but in our next stop, we're going to talk about possibly the most famous man to be held here in Richmond Bridewell, which was Daniel O'Connell. So we're going to go upstairs and talk a bit about that now. O'Connell, for those who don't know, was the politician who dominated the first half of the 19th century in Ireland. So first of all, he campaigned for Catholic emancipation, full rights for Catholics, and then for repeal of the Union, so for the return of the Irish Parliament to Ireland, which had been abolished in 1800. And O'Connell is charged with treason. But there's a catch. Who runs the prisons in Dublin City at the time? It's Dublin Corporation. And who is the mayor of Dublin at the time? It's Daniel O'Connell. So instead of being put in the cells and having to pick oakum and stay on the treadmill and stuff like that, O'Connell gets put up in the governor's residence. Now, we're going to go around the side of the campus now, and we're going to talk about another famous political prisoner who was held here, James Stephens. Okay, let's go. Folks, this is the James Stephens building, and the complex was remodeled quite a lot by the British Army, but this is one of the prison blocks that's converted into accommodation for soldiers later on. So it does give you an idea of what the prison blocks look like. Some of them were actually knocked down when they remodeled the campus. Okay, if you can gather in nice and closely here so you can see the plaque. This is a plaque to another Fenian, Joseph Poole, who was hanged here and executed in 1883. So Poole is a member of the Fenians, the same organisation founded by James Stephens and others. Now, if you're executed, you're buried in the place of execution in an unmarked grave. Just a few years later, the prison is moved out of there because the British Army takes over the site. Now, at that point, his body is discovered when they're excavating the buildings, and his family appealed for the return of his body, and this was denied, and his body was buried again anonymously somewhere here in the complex. Later on still, when the Irish Army took over the barracks after 1922, the family again appealed that the body be returned and he'd be buried, in a marked grave and so on. And a search is made by the Irish Army. Unfortunately, the body is not found. So Joseph Poole's body was actually never found to this day, but it is marked by this plaque. Joseph Poole, 1855 to 1883. Okay, we're going to go on to our next stop, which is just around the corner, the Wellington building, to talk about Wellington Barracks. This is the Wellington building. This was the officers' quarters of the complex when it was a British Army barracks. Now, just a bit about the layout. So as I said, this is the officer quarters. The men were typically put up in the old cells. So most of these buildings around here were the old cells, but there was another wing that was demolished, actually, that was in the middle. Now, the British Army's occupation of the site comes to an end in 1922. So you have the Anglo-Irish Treaty. Among the terms of the Anglo-Irish Treaty is the British Army leaves all of the 26 counties of the Irish Free State. They leave here in April 1922, and the Irish Army marches in. So I'm going to take you around the side of the barracks, the other side of the barracks, and I'll talk about what happened then. Let's go. Okay, so last stop. Now, a couple of things. That there was the guard room of the barracks, okay? Where the National School is today, that was the parade ground. So you have to imagine a big wide open space. The building there, the student residence, of course, that wasn't there. So you had a big, as I said, view over the canal. In fact, it was overlooked by buildings across the canal. And finally, this gap in the building, that wasn't there either, because you went from the parade ground into the square in there, so the soldiers are supposed to march through here. Now, okay, some of the darkest of the many dark things, I suppose, that happened here in Griffith happened just after the Irish Army took over the barracks, because, of course, we had a civil war. During the Civil War itself, the barracks does two things. It houses, for the first half of the Civil War, the Eastern Division of the National Army, which is again around a battalion of troops, but it also houses prisoners. So what's there, you see what's there in the National Stadium? That was originally the gym of the barracks, and that was crammed full of prisoners. There's about 800 prisoners kept here during the Civil War, and a little bit like when it was a prison, they're rotated through here. They're kind of processed, and then they're sent out to prisons and camps and so on. The Irish Army has a long occupation afterwards, but in the 1990s there's a downsizing of Irish barracks around the country, and the army moves out. So the site is acquired by Dermot Hegarty, it becomes Griffith College, and it becomes the great educational establishment we have today. So that's my tour. Thank you very much. And yeah, I have like 15 minutes, so any questions, you're welcome to go up and talk to me. If not, I release you.
The eye wasn't
If you go into the archives, you can find out.
John, do you know when the gym was turned into?